Chapter 2. Harry was arrested. Not immediately, of course. First, there was a shocked reaction from the crowd. Legendary British Reserve was in short supply, as it quickly dawned on the audience this was, in fact, not part of the show. Screams were followed by calls for, "Is there a doctor in the house?" Lawrence Baxter was the first to the tableau, looking a bit mystified at what was expected of him, his medical education being long past. He looked at Harry, he looked at Oscar, he looked at the bloody wound in the one-armed man's back, and from where I was now standing, he looked a bit pale and wobbly. Perhaps it had been for the best that he had abandoned medicine in favor of magic. The cries from the crowd had summoned a stern old woman to this stage, clutching a first aid kit in her bony hands. I recognized her as the lady who had been running the coat check. My first impression of her, that she was a dead ringer for Mrs. Danvers from the first film version of Rebecca, was reinforced as she slowly moved across the stage. Despite her slow pace and obvious frail condition, she took immediate and complete charge of the situation. "Oh, Miss Hess, thank God. There's been an accident," Lawrence Baxter said as he turned to her with evident relief. "So I've heard," she said calmly, in what I recognized as probably a German accent. "Move, let me see what's a fuss is." He stepped aside and she moved in, glancing first at Harry and then down at the body. "Yes, well, we will not need this," she said, thrusting the first aid kit into Baxter's trembling hands. "This man is beyond bandages and antiseptic spray. If the police have not been called yet, they must be." "But what? Why?" Baxter nearly whimpered. "Because this man is dead," she explained with flat simplicity, and then she hobbled off the stage as slowly as she had arrived. The police reached the same conclusion Miss Hess had come to, albeit without her Germanic directness. In a matter of moments, the auditorium was overcome with a rush of activity. EMTs sprinted in, followed immediately by the police. The order was given for the auditorium to be cleared, and the crowd moved down to the second-floor Devant room and the first-floor clubroom, where the police would likely question potential witnesses. I had other plans. I grabbed Megan's hand. "Eli, we're going in the wrong direction," Megan said as I maneuvered us toward the stage. "I have to get to Harry," I said loudly over the hubbub of the retreating crowd. Megan must have agreed with me, for she tightened her grip on my hand as we made slow but steady progress. We pushed upstream against the moving crowd until we reached a door to the left of the stage. I gave it a firm push and was relieved to feel it open. A moment later, we were backstage, which was just as chaotic but not nearly as crowded as the auditorium. The first person I encountered was Liam, the young magician who had so admired my card Presto product. He was pale and shaken, wiping at his nose with his sleeve. He saw me and shook his head. "I moved the chair where they said to," he said, his voice choking. "That's all I did was move the chair." "Yes, boy, and you keep moving," Miss Hess said, coming up from behind him. "This is no place for you now. Move along. Geh rig. Schnell, schnell." "I'll give it a rest," another voice cut in. I turned to see Angelica, the female magician I had seen earlier. She was moving through the backstage area, headed toward the door we had just come through. "Give the poor lad a moment to breathe, for bloody sake, you heartless old crone." She draped an arm over the teenager's shoulder, while the old German woman mumbled something unintelligible before turning and heading away, making her way slowly through a small crowd of police. "Come on. They need us out of here, love," Angelica said to the teen. "Let's head downstairs and see what's what." We stepped aside. She guided the boy through the door, and the two of them disappeared back into the auditorium. We finally spotted Harry, deep in conversation with a man and a woman I guessed were the British version of plainclothes detectives. They were just outside of an area which had been quickly cordoned off by the crime scene team. Their version of a CSI tech was snapping photos of Oscar, who was still slumped over in his large wooden throne. Harry glanced my way and nodded, which I took to mean that, under the circumstances, he was doing okay. Made me feel a little better, but not by much. I wanted to walk over and confirm this with him. However, given the demeanor of the police who were questioning him, I suspected Harry was out of bounds, at least for the next few minutes. "Eli!" I turned toward the sound of my name and saw Lawrence Baxter waving me over to a small group huddled on the far side of the stage. Steering clear of the crime scene, Megan and I snaked our way across the backstage area and joined the small assembly. I recognized the hefty British comic magician Angus Bishop and a renowned mentalist who went by the single name Boris, spelled B-O-R-Y-S. Like Baxter, both were in their 70s, and although they were not as decrepit as Miss Hess, neither had the same youthful energy Baxter projected. Joining the group as we arrived was another older gentleman with the whitest hair I had ever seen. While his deep tan appeared genuine, there was something about his hair that didn't. Although probably just as old as his contemporaries in this small group, his frosty hair gave him an ageless and timeless look. He leaned into the group and whispered conspiratorially, but not quietly. "Harry didn't do it, I'm sure of it," he said in a clipped American accent. "I couldn't get very close, but from what I could see, it appeared the knife actually came out of the base of the chair, attached to an armature of some kind. It traveled up on an arc, sweeping up behind the chair directly into the occupant's back. Then, via some mechanism I couldn't discern, the arm swung back underneath the chair. But the knife did not," Lawrence Baxter added dryly. "Sadly, no," the white-haired man agreed. He glanced over at me and Megan, then back to Lawrence Baxter, who immediately picked up the social cue. Yes, this is Harry Mark's nephew, Eli," he said, reaching out and patting my shoulder. "And," he continued, tossing the next introduction to me. "And this is Megan," I said, unnecessarily putting my arm around her shoulder. I wasn't sure what other words were needed to describe our relationship. Calling her my girlfriend made me feel like we were still in junior high, while referring to her as my partner sounded like we worked together in a law firm. It was my strategy to lock down a more permanent relationship status while on this trip, but for the time being, I just let her name hang in the air. Baxter continued the introductions. "Brilliant. Of course, this is Angus Bishop," he continued, gesturing toward the broadly built gentleman to his left. "And Boris," he added, indicating the thin, wiry man who was dwarfed next to Angus. "And of course, Davis de Vries," he added, referring to the man with the amazingly white hair. "I certainly know all of you by reputation," I said, quickly shaking hands with each of the older gentlemen. Angus, not surprisingly, had a strong grip in proportion to his bulk. I've never actually met a longshoreman, but I suspect some of them would be intimidated by Angus's size and girth, despite his advancing years. Boris was slighter of build, short and rail-thin, with wide eyes which had both a feral and fearful quality. His grip was non-existent, like shaking hands with a wisp of air, while Davis de Vries shook my hand enthusiastically for several seconds longer than necessary. They all then turned to Megan, clearly far more interested in shaking hands with her. Having spent more than her fair share of time in the company of old magicians who fawned over younger women, she complied graciously. "I'm not a magician," she explained to the group, "but Eli prepped me on all the performers who were going to be part of the celebration, except," she added, turning to Davis de Vries, "for you." "Just so," he said, breaking into a wide smile. "I'm the performer behind the performers. The man behind the curtain, as it were. De Vries builds many of the best illusions we all use," Baxter said, then noticed Boris was shrugging at this description. "That is to say, all of us who do big-box illusions." "Mr. de Vries created the Baker's Dozen," I explained to Megan. "We saw it last year at the Magic Live convention in Las Vegas. You know, The illusion where it appears the magician cuts the assistant into 13 even slices? Megan reflexively shuddered at the memory, producing a slight chuckle from DeVries. Not to worry. I'm currently working on a gluten-free version, he said, offering a practiced one-liner. Polite chuckles were had all around. He'll also be unveiling his latest creation this week, although he's too modest to tout it, Lawrence Baxter added. The Catherine wheel should be a corker. There were excited rumbles of agreement on this point, and then, collectively, the group suddenly seemed to realize that a somber attitude would be more appropriate given the situation. For example, the fact Oscar Korhonen was still slumped over in his chair on the other side of the stage. Well, yes. Anyway, Baxter continued, we must do whatever the police require of us to sort this mess out as quickly as possible. Terrible thing. There were nods of assent all around, but no actual plan was suggested. I was about to point out this missing element when I noticed Harry and the two plainclothes police officers moving toward us. I thought they were coming to talk to us, but their pace didn't slacken as they veered around the group, heading for the stage door in the back. Harry's wrists were handcuffed, but he was able to turn toward me and speak before they pulled him through the door and into the stairwell. These are not the linking rings I was planning on employing this evening, he said with a weak smile, gesturing to the cuffs while clearly working hard to keep any fear out of his voice. Don't worry, Eli, we'll get this sorted out. The small group watched as the stage door closed ominously behind him. The group of old men then turned to me. I'm sure their expressions mirrored mine, and we were all thinking a similar thought. Getting this all sorted out might not be quite as easy as Harry was suggesting. One of the uniformed constables told us which police station Harry had been taken to, so I excused Megan and myself from the group with the promise to keep them all apprised of what we learned. Lawrence Baxter pressed a business card in my hand, and then Megan and I headed downstairs to call a cab. Megan reminded me we needed to retrieve our coats, which meant standing in a short but slow-moving line in front of the coat check window. As we inched forward, I could see the attendant, Miss Hess, inspect each claim stub closely, as if there had been a recent rash of counterfeit claims and subsequent missing coats. After each examination, she would disappear into the bowels of her cloakroom for what seemed like a long time for such a simple and direct mission. Then she would return and hand over the coat, still bristling with suspicion as she shooed the person away and indicated the next in line should get a move on. Very few actual words were exchanged throughout. Instead, this was all communicated with a harsh series of grimaces, scowls, and Teutonic-sounding grunts. Since we had arrived separately, we each presented her with our own claim tickets. She looked closely at both tickets and then just as intently at the two of us. You arrive unaccompanied and yet depart jointly, she said, more statement than question, lacing the comment with what sounded like a heaping dollop of judgment for good measure. That is curious. Life is curious, I countered, deciding this scary old lady had not cornered the market on enigmatic phraseology. In more ways than you'll ever know, she replied quietly as she turned to retrieve our items. Each of our coats, neither of which struck me as being particularly heavy, were of sufficient bulk that the old woman felt the need to bring them to us separately. She struggled with each coat as if its pockets were loaded down with heavy stones. Finally, she finished with us, handing Megan her coat without a word, then signaled to the patron behind us that their time had in fact come. A flight risk? That's absurd, I huffed indignantly. Sadly, my voice cracked on the last word, thereby sucking any authority out of my intended outrage. The police detective, a tired woman in her early 40s who identified herself as Detective Inspector Matthews, sighed and continued her explanation of their reasons for holding Harry in a jail cell overnight and why my request to see him had been denied. Her accent was a delightful mix of British and Indian, but currently that was the only thing about her that might be considered delightful. To be fair, I imagine she wasn't finding me to be particularly enchanting either. As I explained, Mr. Marks, this is a capital crime. Your uncle's behavior is, at the very least, questionable. Really? How do you figure? D.I. Matthews sighed deeply and looked down at her notes. He arrived at 2:30 this afternoon from the U.S. for, he claims, the sole purpose of being on stage with the victim this evening. He booked a hotel for one night only. He came to the scene of the crime directly from the airport, and although he claimed to be staying in town for just one night, he had checked 2 large bags for the flight. He and the victim were alone backstage for several minutes. He was standing next to Mr. She glanced down at her notes. Next to Mr. Korhonen when he was killed. And he is holding a return airline ticket that will take him out of the country tomorrow at noon, a mere 12 hours from now. She set her notes down and looked across the table at me. All in all, singly and in its totality, this is behavior we on the force would judge to be, at the very least, questionable. He didn't kill him, I began, but she held up a hand. That is not for you or me to determine, sir, Matthews said firmly. If the decision is made to charge your uncle, which I believe to be highly likely, our legal system will do an excellent job of determining his guilt or innocence. But for the time being, specifically this evening, he is considered a flight risk and will remain under our supervision until tomorrow at the earliest, at which time our prosecutors will determine and present their next steps. Although the accent and some of the terminology was different, this all had a very familiar ring to me. My ex-wife was an assistant district attorney back in Minneapolis, and her new husband was a hulking golem who made his living as a homicide detective. I had been on the receiving end of his sleep-inducing officiousness on more than one occasion. If experience has taught me anything, it was that it was fruitless to argue with City Hall, particularly if City Hall had taken the human form of an underpaid and overworked homicide detective. Now it is my recommendation that you return to your hotel and come back in the morning, and at that time we will have more information to share on your uncle and his situation vis-a-vis this ongoing murder investigation. I'm sure there are some fundamental differences between the U.S. and British criminal justice systems, but the way all their people straighten up papers and close folders to signal the end of a conversation is eerily identical. It was a return trip to the hotel for Megan, but the first time for me. The streets were dark, and my sense of direction was a shambles. So instead of being adventurous and exploring the subway system, we hopped into a nearby cab. Megan had the hotel's name and address at her fingertips, and a few minutes later, we pulled up to what was going to be our home away from home for the next week on our first vacation as a couple. The exterior looked a little worn and run down, but I chalked it up to the poor street lighting and a moonless night. The interior, however, had no such excuses to fall back on. "Isn't it adorable?" Megan whispered as we made our way down the front hallway toward the small lobby. "It's like stepping back in time." "You mean before the invention of the vacuum cleaner?" I suggested. I looked down, convinced small puffs of dust were emanating from each step we made on the worn carpet. The fuzzy first impression the foyer made was reinforced tenfold the moment we entered the small lobby. Mismatched Christmas lights had been strung haphazardly over the front desk, although most of the bulbs weren't lit. A worn, lopsided couch sat by the window next to a rack filled with faded tourist brochures. Beside the rack was a wobbly-looking card table with what could only be called a vintage PC atop it. The computer screen glowed a sickly green. Someone with either no sense of irony or The finest wit since Oscar Wilde had printed up a small dot matrix placard touting the table as the Busness Center. Yes, business was in fact misspelled. What was the Yelp rating on this place? I asked Megan quietly as we waited for the hairy desk clerk to finish what sounded like an angry phone call. His tone was indignant, which was evident regardless of the language. It sounded like Russian, but my knowledge of that language was confined to villains trying in vain to kill James Bond. Oh, the reviews were terrible, but I read through them, and the criticisms were just dumb Americans complaining about moronic things, she explained happily. I love it here. Before I could inquire as to which things the dumb Americans had railed against, the desk clerk finished his call by slamming the receiver down hard on the cradle and saying something that sounded like a curse, regardless of the language. He then looked up and gave us, well, Megan at least, a toothy smile. "You are back," he said as he turned to the crooked set of wooden cubbies hanging precariously on the wall behind him. "Your night I was good?" "It was interesting," Megan said as he handed her the key. It was attached by what appeared to be baling wire to a plastic tag bearing our room number. "Interesting is good?" he asked, still smiling his toothy grin. His short-cropped hair stood straight up on top of his head, while his bright blue eyes bulged just the tiniest bit. "Interesting is good, yes," Megan agreed. "Good night." "Good night to you and to you too, sir," he said, waving at us happily as we moved out of the lobby and back to the hallway. I followed Megan, who took a confident leap, leading us to the elevator door. She pushed the up button. "Russian?" I asked. She shrugged. "I have no idea, but he's clearly not from around here." "Well, neither are we," I said, and then looked over at the elevator doors as they wobbled open. A dim light illuminated the elevator car, but that term was giving it way too much credit. It was like a phone booth, but smaller. "This may be the smallest elevator I've ever seen," I said. "I've seen dumbwaiters more spacious." "I know. Isn't it great?" she beamed as she stepped in. I turned sideways and wedged myself into the small box. Megan pressed the button for the 4th floor. The doors quavered shut, and with a small lurch, the elevator began to climb. "You know, I once made a refrigerator box for it that was bigger than this elevator," I observed, marveling at the tiny space. "How did you ever get upstairs with all of our luggage?" "Oh, that was easy," she said, turning so my elbow wasn't digging into her shoulder. "I just piled all the bags in here, hit the button for our floor, then ran up the stairs." "Let me guess. You beat the elevator by a considerable margin," I suggested, as the car whined and stuttered its way up. "They call it a lift, and yes, I had plenty of time to catch my breath, if that's what you mean." I was going to continue the conversational topic, but I began to fear we'd run out of oxygen in the small space, so I just nodded and waited for the ride to be over. Sleep came quickly, and my only dreams consisted of continually awaking, thinking I was trapped inside a coffin. You might think I was flashing back to our ride up in the lift, but when it came to small spaces, our room gave the elevator a run for its money. I'd already assembled a growing mental list I was sure would match up, point by point, with the complaints generated by the dumb Americans on Yelp. For her part, Megan loved the place, so I wisely kept my mouth shut. The fact was, the inconveniences were minor, and we had come to London to see the sights, not to become roving hotel critics. Seeing her happy and having fun erased any other issues I might be having with our accommodations. Once we were showered and dressed, we made our way to the communal breakfast room and showed our room key, which entitled each of us to what was advertised as a traditional English breakfast. Moments after we had settled in, before they had even offered coffee or tea, a wait person delivered 2 overflowing plates to our table and then disappeared as quickly as she had come. I looked down at the plate that had been put in front of me, then looked to see if a similar disaster had befallen Megan. "What is this?" I asked, my voice a little hoarse, either from lack of use or flat-out fear. "It's a traditional English breakfast," Megan said brightly. "No, seriously, what is this?" She picked up her fork and pointed tentatively at each of the alleged food items on the plate as she introduced them. "I think this is back bacon. Those are fried eggs. This looks like a grilled tomato. And that's gotta be a mushroom of some kind. Those are sausages. And this pile here is baked beans." She sat back, clearly proud of her achievement. She had tried to sound authoritative, but I could tell she was flat out guessing at a couple of items. I looked at the plate again, then at the waitstaff as they bustled around the room. Did we do something wrong? Are they mad at us? A buzz alerted me to a text from Lawrence Baxter, informing me that he'd secured a lawyer, a solicitor in his terminology, who would be meeting with Harry as soon as they would allow him this morning. Baxter suggested meeting at the police station at 10:30. I texted back we would see him there. "You can always spot the Americans," Megan whispered, nodding at a couple as they entered and were seated by the hostess, "even before they say a word." I was about to question the validity of this statement when the female half of the duo said in a too loud and grating American accent, "Oh, do we have to sit by a radiator?" She spat out the word like someone who had been relocated against their will to a site less desirable than Chernobyl or Love Canal. Megan was ahead. One love. And I made the mental note that if asked, I would say we hailed from Canada. The game then became guessing the nationality of the people who weren't obviously Americans. Megan had a better facility with languages than I did, so she was able to offer linguistic predictions with far greater speed and accuracy than I could. For example, her prediction the little boy with the Harry Potter glasses was French proved dead on when he continually ignored his mother's request to stop swinging his legs while he sat, repeating the word "none" over and over again. To love. We did agree the family across from us, grandmother, mother, and a younger boy, were likely Russian or perhaps Ukrainian. They ate silently, but I heard the grandmother whisper, "Edidadoshkai," to her table mates. My wish to be able to translate it was granted a few moments later, when the woman I was assuming was her daughter whispered to the younger boy, "For pop-pop." With these instructions in place, the two each handed the grandmother an item from their plate, a roll from one and an apple from the other, which she stealthily slipped into her purse. My study of this interesting family dynamic was interrupted by the appearance of two very large and very loud Americans, who squeezed into the table directly next to ours and began a long series of complaints concerning just about everything in sight. Before they could add us to their list, we finished our coffee and quickly exited. The police station was no less cheery in the light of day. Lawrence Baxter met us at the front door and filled us in as we made our way down to the gray, airless visitor waiting area. There was a surprising amount of activity for a Sunday morning, probably all stemming from Saturday night incidents, hopefully all less deadly than the one at the Magic Circle. "My solicitor's in with Harry now," he said quietly. "He said, given this is a capital crime, they are well within their rights to hold Harry for 72 hours before charging him." "So he thinks they're going to charge him?" I said, speaking much louder than intended. Baxter shook his head. "He's not sure. My understanding is the prosecutor will bring the facts of the case before a magistrate tomorrow morning. The magistrate will determine if there is enough evidence to warrant pressing charges." He gestured toward 3 empty chairs in the crowded waiting room. "So, at the very least, Harry isn't getting out today." I exchanged a look with Megan as we sat. It was clear we were both thinking the same question, but I said it out loud first. "Which one of us is going to call Franny?" Megan shrugged, and I shrugged in return. We had agreed to hold off calling Harry's soon-to-be new bride until we had more information. Currently, I wasn't quite sure if what Lawrence Baxter had related counted as enough intelligence to bring Franny up to speed without simultaneously throwing her into a panic. "She told him not to take this trip," Megan reminded me softly. "I know, but it seems unlikely Franny would take this down the I told you so road. At least, not right away. Plus, she was planning on picking him up at the airport." I looked at my watch, which I had not reset. It's not even 6 a.m. in Minneapolis. We might as well wait until she's up. No need to get her out of bed at this point. Megan nodded in agreement, and I turned to Lawrence, but he held up a hand. "Here's Wexler Smith," he said, looking toward the heavy steel door that stood between visitors and the poor souls they had come to visit. Just coming through the entry was a middle-aged man in a perfectly tailored pinstripe suit, making him the odds-on favorite as the best-dressed person in the room. His bushy white mustache and eyebrows gave him a sad hangdog appearance, which was reinforced by his slumped posture and slow, ponderous step.
"Nothing too positive to report, Baxter, sorry to say," he said in a low, Nigel Bruce-like growl. "Too much red tape. High visibility of the crime, flight risk, foreigner. It all adds up. Bad business, if you ask me. Strictly by the book on this one. That's my guess."
Lawrence Baxter nodded at the recitation, then introduced us to Simon Wexler Smith, his longtime solicitor. The sad-faced man mumbled some words of condolence as he shook hands with me, then Megan.
"What are our next steps?" Baxter asked once the social niceties had been acknowledged. "Wait for the magistrate's decision," Wexler Smith replied confidently. "Not much we can do until then, I'm afraid. Hands tied and all that."
"Any chance I can see Harry?" I cut in, looking from lawyer to Baxter. "Like, this morning? Now?" Figuring Wexler Smith was the one with the power, I concentrated my attention on him, but he turned impotently to Baxter. The solicitor may have been an expert on law, but Lawrence Baxter was a bona fide star in this country, and that would likely count for more.
"Let me see what I can do," Baxter said quietly,
unnecessarily straightening his suit jacket as he headed toward the main desk. 5 minutes later, I was being ushered through the imposing metal door, which closed with a sickening thud behind me. Getting through the entry was just the first step in a journey which included emptying all my pockets, going through 2 different scanners, and then a full-body pat-down by a clammy-handed middle-aged constable who, I sensed, had already reached his maximum level of tedium by this early hour. Regardless of how my day was going to go, I thought, as they led me down the 3rd blank hallway, his was likely to consist of performing this same series of actions on a never-ending stream of strangers. Made me feel a little better, but not much. My Uncle Harry was not a large man. He resisted the word elfin, but it wasn't far off the mark. However, when I first spotted him on the other side of the glass in the cramped booth where they'd placed him, he seemed even smaller than usual. I sat down on the hard plastic chair on my side of the glass. We reached for our respective phone receivers at the same time, and then paused before saying anything into them. My receiver was warm and a bit sticky.
"I know what you're thinking,"
he finally said, his voice sounding tired, distant, and tinny through the receiver.
"And I agree. Orange is not my color."
He glanced down at the jail-issued jumpsuit and gave an exaggerated shudder.
"And I don't even dare consider how they may have hung up my tux," he added, "if they've hung it up at all."
For Harry, and many magicians of his era, the proper care and storage of one's tux was an issue of paramount importance, right up there with cleaning your coins and ironing your silks. In fact, once he was dressed in his tux before a show, Harry absolutely refused to sit down, as he felt bending his knees would negatively impact the line of his trousers. It was possible that attitude may have helped to save his life the night before, as it was Oscar who, apparently harboring no such qualms about the line of his tux, had opted to take a seat in the deadly chair. "Are you doing okay?" I asked, figuring we must be on a set time limit and wanting to make the most of what might be a short conversation. He shrugged.
"Not bad. The people have been nice. The cell, however, is tiny, minuscule."
I thought of mentioning the size of our hotel room, but quickly decided this was not the right time for a quick game of travel adversity one-upmanship.
"Have you talked to Franny?"
he continued, his brow furrowing in worry. I shook my head. "Megan and I decided to wait until I'd seen you," I said, "so we could give her a more complete report." He nodded at the decision, but I could tell he was concerned about her reaction to the news.
"She told me not to come," he said. "She said there were bad vibrations."
"You met her more than halfway," I countered. "Only staying one night, getting in and getting out quickly. It was a good compromise."
"Yes, with apparently sparkling results."
I didn't have a helpful response, so I changed the subject. "What have they told you about what happened to Oscar?"
"Nothing directly, but I've heard enough to piece most of it together," he said,
leaning forward as he shifted into magic instructor mode, a persona I had experienced my whole life.
"Apparently there was a device in the chair. As soon as one sat on the cushion, the pressure triggered the release of an arm on a powerful spring under the seat. It shot up out of the back of the chair on a semicircle and plunged the knife into the poor fellow's back. Then the arm retracted. Very clever, actually," he added,
acknowledging his grudging admiration at the design of the deadly device. "Well, that's basically what Davis DeVries thought happened," I said, quickly recounting my short conversation with the small group of old magicians backstage.
"Yes, of course DeVries had figured out quickly," Harry said. "Those sorts of mechanics are right up his alley."
I don't think he recognized the implications of this statement, but he was already on to another topic before I could press him on it. I made a mental note to come back to that thought at some point.
"The thing is, Buster, it was only a couple of moments before the curtain even opened that the two of us decided who would be sitting and who would be standing," Harry said,
turning as the door to his cubicle opened behind him. A guard stood there, silently indicating the time was up.
"We'd gone back and forth on that decision for nearly 30 minutes, and we finally just decided it with a coin flip."
He turned to the guard and acknowledged his presence, indicating we were wrapping things up. "Harry, I want to do something to move this thing along, but I have no idea what I should be doing." He turned back to me, standing, but still holding on to the receiver.
"I thought of it the moment I woke up, and then kicked myself for not thinking of it last night. We've got to get in touch with McHugh."
As soon as he mentioned the name, I wanted to kick myself as well. McHugh was the one person who should have been my first phone call the previous night. "Yes, of course," I said, also standing, although I wasn't entirely certain why. "How do I find him?"
"What day is it?"
Harry asked, moving as slowly as he could to hang the receiver back up on its hook. "Sunday," I said quickly.
"Perfect,"
Harry said as he backed away from the chair, still holding the phone.
"Tower Hill Tube Stop, 7:30 tonight, sharp."
The guard took the receiver from Harry's hand and hung it up. I nodded furiously that I understood. As he was being ushered out of the cubicle, he turned and added one final thought. I could hear his voice distantly through the not-so-soundproof glass.
"And Eli?"
he said. "Yes?" I shouted. He was able to get his last words in before the door slammed shut.
"Wear comfortable shoes."